Oh, great. Now you get to listen to him babbling about his books.
Okay, good afternoon. This is John McKay. I am the Cranky Old Historian. And today I'm going to get back to talking about kind of like pure history in a way. The other day when I did my reading history book episode, rather, I talked about that I'd written a few books. Today's episode is about writing history, and I thought I would just sort of talk a little bit about it and what's it like. And I can't give you any tips to get into it because the whole world has changed so much since I started writing books back in the 90s. But I will tell you what actually got me started was I went to college a little later than in life. Didn't start till I was 29 to start to college. And I ended up taking a couple of English courses, of course, and the usual history stuff. And I had a history professor who really liked what I had to say because I liked all the oddball stuff and he did too. So I had written a paper about the Civil War Battle of New Hope Church, which is a fairly small, mostly unknown battle as part of the Atlanta campaign, but it actually had an outsized effect on the campaign itself. And he encouraged me to clean up the language a little bit and make it a little less formal and submit it to publication. There were several Civil War magazines. There's still, I think, one or two left. And they were forever and a day looking for people. I did. I submitted it to them. The publisher liked it. He published it. And then not long thereafter, I started getting contacted. And this is where the whole foot in the door thing comes in. If you can ever get your foot in the door, you can usually make it. And I stumbled into it. I was teaching at the time. By the time I did all this, I just started my first classroom teaching job. And as a history teacher, especially a history professor, you're kind of expected to produce, you're expected to write. And you're expected to write academic stuff. And I'm sorry, that's like watching grass grow, most of those articles. Some of them are vaguely interesting. Most of them are written for each other. The vast majority, I have a suspicion, are written because, well, I have to, publish or die. One of the two. So that's the way it goes. I got contacted by the publisher of a travel book series called Insider's Guides out of Mateo, North Carolina. And he asked me, he said, I'd really like to talk to you about writing a book for us. And I'm like, I'm a historian, I don't know squat about writing travel literature. And he said, well, we can train that. He said that travel history books or historic travel books are traditionally written by by travel writers. And they sort of kind of pick up on the history as they go. And he wanted to do exactly the opposite. He wanted to get historians to write the historic travel book and then teach us how to do like the restaurant reviews and all that kind of stuff that goes into the travel books. So I had a great time writing it. That was my very first book. Matter of fact, this is it. I'll have Pett stick up a picture of it. I wrote 3 editions of it. And then what a lot of people don't realize is books of this level, popular history, especially travel books, anything like that, the author's name you see in the front may not be the one who actually wrote it to begin with. Like I said, Insider's Guide was a series of travel books, actually really good ones. And they got swallowed up by a larger publisher who in turn got swallowed up by an even larger publisher. And now they're part of the board. I think this book is still in print under a slightly different name, but has somebody's totally different name on the as the author of it. And this is what they do: is they take an edition. They say, and I did this with another book I partially wrote called Insider's Guide to Atlanta. And I was asked, "Would you take this over? You've already written for us. You know our system. We need somebody to pick it up." The original author did like 5 or 6 editions. They're tired. They want to move on. And so I picked it up and I rewrote probably a third of it, thereabouts, and updated the rest of the information and then publish it. Now, getting back to this just for a second, and what it's like to write history and what it's like to write something like this. Well, this was a little different on a number of levels. Number one, it's history. when you're writing history, you've got a double whammy going. You've got you want to write something that people who are accustomed to reading fiction will read. You're not writing this for people like me who are just fanatic history fans. You're writing this to a larger market, a mass market. That's what you're looking for. So you got to be able to write. And it turns out that I'm not a very good writer. I'm okay. I can put sentences together, mostly. I only had moderate fights that rarely turned into violence with my publisher about stuff that I'd written down there. I mean, we had a pretty good relationship, sort of. But it's difficult because you've got to write something that catches your attention and moves on. And I learned about this first from that very article I mentioned a minute ago. What's really kind of funny is I wrote this article about this very small, practically unknown unit called the Georgia State Line, which was a regiment, actually two regiments, that were the governor of Georgia, Joe Brown, his private army. A lot of these guys, it was sort of like a National Guard-ish sort of situation, except they really only answered to him. And they did not go into battle until New Hope Church in May of 1864. The rest of the time they were kept in the state, and then they left the Army of Tennessee, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, when it left the state to go north and get destroyed up in Nashville. Not very many people have written, as far as I know, there's only two or three other historians beside myself who've ever written about that. One of the archivists at the Georgia Archives told me one time, I was working on another book about this unit that had unit information about this unit, and I wanted to pull some original documents from it. So Charlotte Ray, who was the chief archivist there, she pulled the stuff for me. Lovely lady. And she said, you're only the third one since the Civil War to ever look at these. Really? Wow. Because it's a small unit. It had an outsized effectiveness on the battlefield. A lot of these guys were combat veterans. They just come back to the state. They didn't want to fight in the big armies anymore, but they did want to defend their state. There's a lot of guys like that. Had very good leadership for the most part. And they were very effective. Matter of fact, in the Battle of Atlanta, the only offensive action of the entire day was centered around the Georgia State Line and its charge at the railway viaduct, which was where Little Five Points is today, in Battle of East Atlanta. But one of these days I'll get all geeked out about the Battle of Atlanta and tell you several hours of what it was like, because that's really my favorite campaign to talk about. But you have to, but then you have this travel book on top of it. Okay, you got people who are traveling. And one of the reviews I had on Amazon for this book said, well, he wrote a lot of extra stuff. There's a lot of sidebars. There's a lot of explanations about how units work on. And a legitimate complaint about the book was probably anybody who picked up this book already knew all that stuff. Okay, fair enough. But I was asked to put it in there. Okay, and I had no problem doing it. So I got to be a little snarky. I had to be very straightforward. When it came to hotels or restaurants, I just, hey, this is some places to go eat, and yeah, they're fine. And one of these days I'll tell you about the travel book racket that I learned during that time. It's like I had no idea that this existed. But I got to travel around to all these battlefields, a few of which I'd never been to before, and this is wonderful. And I believe very strongly you actually have to go to the battlefield itself to write about it. And I have learned that I'm kind of odd that way, that not every historian does that. Well, we can do it through the documents. Well, if you've been paying any attention to my podcast so far, and I've got four regular viewers, so maybe you find out that I have a lot to say about stuff like this, and there's a lot of people who don't do that kind of stuff, and who just, these days I assume they're getting AI to write everything. I mean, why not? So that's my rant about that. I'm not going to go any further down that hill. You have to go to the place, you have to read the documents, you've got to read the records, you got to read the memoirs. The Civil War is this rich treasure house. That's why so many people are so fascinated with it. There is probably a good, at least 200,000 books on the Civil War still in print. Probably. Easily. A lot of those are the kind of books I love. Just a little bit like, here is the Battle of Resaca. Here is the Battle of Pickett's Mill. And some guy has spent his life studying that tiny little action there and what happened. And I also learned something else while I was writing this. Is I wrote a chapter in there about reenactors. And for a while there, reenacting was a big-time hobby. It's also a big-time expensive hobby, which is why I think it's not all that. It's still kind of big, but probably not as big as it was there for a while. And at one point, some of the people were telling me that was the fastest-growing family hobby in America. Okay, probably. I don't know. I don't know about many more family hobbies there are except spending money at the RAD or something like that. But the reenactors are fascinating because the most of them and all the good ones are very good historians, and they're very good chronologers, and they're very good at going in there and picking out details, sometimes excessively. There was a term when I was hanging around the reenactors, they called it farbing. A farb is a term for something that is out of place or wrong or out of period. Anachronistic is another way of saying it. And they would literally rub their hands on somebody's uniform and said, this is a farbish uniform. This has at least 15 threads per inch where the real one only had 8. I'm not making this up. This is exactly what they're like. There was also a term for the more, what's a good word I'm looking for? The more energetic reenactors, the ones who really wanted to be accurate. And the expression was peeing on his buttons. And it seems that if you take your brass buttons and you get them new from the supplier and they look brand new, and of course, guys out in the field in the Civil War wouldn't look that way for very long, a few days at most. Turns out if you take those buttons off and you soak them in a little bowl full of urine, that they turn this wonderful patina that looks just like you've had them out there in the weather for a couple of years. Yeah, that different breed of people, but phenomenal. Loved to talk about the subject and gave me all kind of insights. I mean, just all kind. It helped me more than I could possibly say write that first book. And that first book is still in print, I think. I think it is in another edition. To give you an idea of what writing history is like for me, let me explain one thing from that book. And in this book, I have chapters of the different Deep South states. I don't talk about the Eastern Theater, which was Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And I do talk about the Carolinas Theater, but not a lot. I talk a little bit. I've got a chapter on Florida. And most of it is on what's called the Western Theater. And Western Theater is Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky. Sometimes Arkansas and Mississippi's put in there, but not usually. Arkansas and Missouri, rather. Then across the Mississippi River, Texas, and all that area, that is the Trans-Mississippi. So the Western Theater's over here in Georgia. That's primarily what I've looked at. Now, there's been, if I said there's 200,000 books in print, easily 150,000 of them are on the Eastern Theater alone. They don't really talk about the Western Theater that much. So I had to dig around and find some things. And one of the things that interested me is when I was writing the South Carolina chapter, and I was writing about the bombardment of Fort Sumter by the Confederacy. The Union, as you know, hopefully you know, was holding Fort Sumter, and it was sort of like one of these, we don't know what we're doing. We have no idea where this is going to go, but let's just hang on here and see how things work out kind of deal in late 1860. And the South Carolinians or the Charlestonians had said, you need to leave. And there was sort of a gentleman's agreement where they would stay there as long as they didn't try to resupply. Well, Southern commander there, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, PGT Beauregard, who was from Louisiana originally, got word that there was going to be an attempt made to force a resupply with a heavily reinforced Union Navy flotilla. So he ordered the surrender of Fort Sumter. The commander, who had been his professor at West Point, I might add, You can see all these funny little things. Said no. And PGT told him, okay, well, at midnight, we will start bombarding you. Okay. So they all got down in Sumters. They got down the shelters. And then at about 12:06 a.m., the first battery fired. Well, see, this is to me is interesting. There has been this gentleman right here, and I'm going to get Pett to stick a picture of him up there. And his name escapes me right at the moment, like so much of life does. But if you look in your history books, and probably in your high school history book, they listed this guy as this is the man who fired the first shot of the war. Well, no. It was fired by a cannon from the James Battery along Charleston Harbor. And then some people went back and said, well, maybe he fired the signal to fire the first shot. Who knows? And I don't even know if the guy was there or not. I do know that when the South surrendered, that he shot himself. He was not going to live in a world without the Confederacy. So we're not talking about somebody who's playing with a full deck. But who was the first shot, and where was it? Well, I dug around, and found out it was this one artillery battery, the James Battery. And there was a Virginia congressman who had been invited down. Edmund Ruffin, that's the guy I was thinking of just a second ago. There was a Virginia congressman who had been in Congress for 10 years going, strike a blow, strike a blow, strike a blow, over and over. This is what we need to do. What's what we need to do. And he was invited to pull the lanyard on the first cannon. And then when it came time to do that, being your typical politician, he demurred and said, no, I just can't do that. So, politicians then were exactly the same as what we're saddled with today. Instead, the captain of the battery just stepped forward without ceremony, yanked the lanyard. Well, then I got interested, because this is where my particular brand of autism comes in, is, okay, it fired a shot. I know the size of the cannon. I know where it was. I know when the lanyard was pulled. I know the shot it was loaded with, and I know it hit inside Fort Sumter. So what I then did is got some maps of Charleston Harbor and my dividers out, and got my calculator out, and I was working on artillery tables from the Civil War, and I was on the floor of my office when my darling wife walked in. And she took one look at what I was doing, and she said, what are you doing? And I said, I kind of gave her the nickel version of what I was doing, with lots of gestures and stuff, And she goes, okay. Is this like a major part of your book? I said, it's probably 5 words, half a sentence, maybe. Oh, and how long have you been working on this? Well, including the time it took to put together all of these materials, about 3 hours. And she goes, uh-huh. And she gave me that look that every Southern man knows. That's like, you've spent 3 hours working on something that's 5 words in your book. Well, it's an important 5 words. How long did it take that first shot to land inside Fort Sumter? Are you curious? I know you are. It was 20.5 seconds. Doesn't that seem like a long time? 20.5 seconds, but that's how long the first shot took. That's the kind of detail I like. Yeah, it took 5-6 words in my book, but it's accurate. And this is what I strove for, is I don't like to talk about things where I don't really have a full grasp of the facts, because you can get embarrassed real easy, real fast. And one of the great historians, Stephen Ambrose, who I truly admired. I loved his work. I have all his books. And he wrote a book about my old regiment, which was the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. I was in 35 years after the events he wrote about in World War II. And he, in that book called Band of Brothers, he wrote about a private Albert Blythe. And Albert had landed in Normandy. He was one of the original guys who was up in Toccoa with the original crew training. And while he was in Normandy, he was shot in the neck and hauled away. And all the veterans told him, yeah, we never saw him again. We heard he died in the hospital. So when they went to make a miniseries out of Band of Brothers, they included this story. Albert Blythe was one whole entire episode. One whole episode. And at the end they mentioned he died in the hospital. Well, there was one problem with that. No, he didn't. He lived. It took him a long time. And matter of fact, I think the war was over by the time he got out. And he ended up staying in the Army, and he was in the 82nd Airborne for a long time. And he went on, and he didn't retire until the 60s, and then I think he actually died not long after that, if I remember. But the thing is Ambrose just simply took the word of these other veterans. Now, admittedly, these are like giants. These were the paratroopers. These were the Currahee men. So I'm sure there was a lot of fandom with him going on with these guys. And, I had met a few back when I was in the regiment. And, yeah, they're just larger in life kind of people. But he made the classic mistake of relying on an eyewitness testimony and never bothered to look up the record. So it's embarrassing to him. Did it really affect the whole narrative? Not really. It was a really good story about him in the movie and or in the miniseries and in the book. There was nothing wrong except for the fact he didn't die. Well, that to me was a horrendous mistake. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that bad. But this is the kind of thing that when you're writing fiction, if you're just sitting there or writing poetry or something, yeah, you're looking for a flow of words, and you're looking for the right words that work, and you're looking for something that's interesting and dynamic and not cliched and that will interest people. And I'm trying to do all the same when I'm writing history books and make them accurate. So that's kind of a story about that, about where I went with that. The book sold pretty well. It still sells pretty well. And one of the things that it allowed me to do is I became the author then. Now, I have often commented that I was kind of neutral about being an author. It's hard work. It's very hard work. And it's the kind of hard work where you are completely self-motivated. And you may have a deadline, which I like the sound of those deadlines they made as they whooshed past my head as I missed every one of them. But I'm trying to make it sound good. I'm trying to make it something you want to read and it's interesting. And at the same time, I'm trying to make it as accurate as humanly possible. There's another story in that book. And it's about a battle in central Tennessee, just south of Murfreesboro. And the name of the battle just escaped my mind again. I'll get Pett to put it up. And in there, and this is when I first started realizing that publishers are not the same as I am. Most historians, the vast majority of historians, tend to be very conservative. Tend to be. At least used to be. And tend to be older males and very conservative. And that's changed a lot. But I was starting to get some comments from my publisher, even from this first book, about, wow, this is a little, harsh language. This is a little warlike. Well, we're talking about a war there, sport, and all this. And I wrote something about this particular battle, Stones River, where both sides were planning on doing exactly the same thing. They were standing off on either side of the river against each other. And both sides had independently come up with a plan to hit the other side's right flank. And if they had pulled it off on time, they would have gone around like a little merry-go-round. But they didn't. And it was raining and nasty. And everybody's lined up. And the armies back in those days were so close, they could easily talk to each other. Especially the vedettes and the pickets. Vedettes are mounted guards. Pickets are ones on their feet standing out there. They could easily talk to you. I mean, they could reach out and shake each other's hands a lot of the time. They were that close. And trade between the two was not uncommon. A lot of battering back and forth. And to buck up their morals, a couple of Union bands, and every regiment had a band, and every larger unit had a band also, started playing various songs. They Battle Hymn of the Republic, which that's a little early for that one. And then Southern bands joined in playing Dixie, of course, and other things. And then I wrote, and this was kind of a poignant moment, if I said that word right. At the end, it's raining, it's sleeting a little bit, it's cold, and to close it out, all the bands joined together one at a time, and all of them on both sides started playing that mournful tune, "Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home." And I wrote that in the darkness and the rain and the sleet, thousands of soldiers on both sides sat there and sang that, and then just sat there in silence waiting for the slaughter to commence in the morning. And I thought, I was putting myself in the way of a soldier, and my publisher, wow, we're going to turn you into a liberal. Yeah, no, you're not going to. That's not what that's about. I identify very strongly with the soldiers. That's what that was all about. But then that's another thing that you have to talk about when you're writing history. Not only are you trying to get the facts right, you're not only trying to make it readable, it has to be something that's interesting that people want to read about. I could write a 3-volume set on the history of the era of good feelings, and it wouldn't sell a copy probably. If I wrote a book, here's who really killed Epstein, it might sell, 1 billion copies, but then I would, probably not be around to talk much about it. You got to fall somewhere in between there. You can't just, if you write just for yourself, that's great. And that's what I did. And that's why my books didn't sell very well. I wrote for myself. I'm doing this for myself. I'm just having a good time and like to talk about it. And that's why I like being an author. And yes, I'm jumping all over the place now. But like I was saying, you have to worry about the facts, you have to worry about the narrative, you have to worry about your writing, you have to worry about all that stuff. Then you have to worry about the publisher themselves. Are they going to be okay with this? Now today, you can publish yourself way easier than you used to. Amazon Kindle for authors is wonderful. You can write straight to Kindle. As a matter of fact, I got a couple of projects I'm toying with going back into writing, but it's tough and a lot of hard work. But being an author was great, because then it was like these libraries, friends of libraries groups, and historical societies, stuff like that, would invite me to come talk about my books. And I loved that. Got to meet a lot of really good people. Got to talk about a lot of interesting things. Said a lot of really bad things. I was at the Atlanta History Center not long after 9/11, and I think it was the first event they had after 9/11. And it was pretty crowded, and it was all Civil War historians. And I'm kind of the junior varsity for all that, because I was a high school teacher, not a college professor. So I was asked if I wouldn't mind talking last. I said, sure, that's fine. And the guy who wrote April 1865 was supposed to be there. I think he had some travel problems. And then my really good friend Stephen Davis from KSU was there, and he had just written one of his books, and he was phenomenal as always. And there was a couple other people who wrote, pretty serious academic histories. And Stephen's a great writer, and except for him, the rest of them honestly were kind of dry. And then I get up there, and being the kind of person who doesn't really care, and I don't care if I get invited back because I know I'm not going to. I got up and I said, hey, because everybody had gotten up and given all their credentials, and sometimes that lasted about 10 minutes for them to do that. And I said, I'm John McKay. I don't have a PhD. I don't teach at a university. I'm a high school history and government teacher. And I write books about what I find interesting, not because I have to do it for, publish or die or anything like that. And I'm just writing because this is what I think will read well. So this is why my books sell 10 times more than the rest of those guys' books combined. Stephen laughed. The rest of them gave me a look like, well, you're not going to be invited back. But I was right, and they knew it. After that, I was asked to write the Atlanta book, Insider's Guide to Atlanta, and I took over and wrote a couple of the chapters for it. That was honestly kind of boring. I didn't get to be too snarky. Sorry, Boo, the Magnificent, our interior security, is in here right now. Say hey, Boo. Say hey. And I had to, it was just pure, here's hotels, here's restaurants, here's, touristy places to go. And yeah, it's a job. And it had its perks, and it was okay. But really wasn't what I was looking to do. And then after that, I was asked to do a few more. And then the biggest thing I spent 5.5 years writing this book right here. And I'll have Pett put it up. Brave Men in Desperate Times, The Lives of Civil War Soldiers. I spent 5.5 years working on that one. Originally, it was actually pitched to me if I would write a book that had, say, 10 to 15 biographies of otherwise unwritten and unheralded soldiers from the Civil War. Okay, that sounds good. I can do that. And problem with that, as I discovered pretty quickly, is there's a reason that people haven't written about a lot of these other guys. There's just not a whole lot about them. So I ended up changing the focus of the book, and the publisher was okay with that. And it's pretty much a general history of the Civil War, but it's talking about very specific things. There's a chapter on German soldiers. There's a chapter on black soldiers. There's a chapter on infantry, on artillery, on cavalry, like how each one of these kinds of soldiers. And then I took what I did find out about these guys and put it into the narrative, which it was okay. I got to be pretty snarky. They were really, snarkiness is my go-to language, and I had a lot to say about these things. And a lot of times my publisher would, no, you can't do that. You can't write that. You can't say that. I'm like, no, please. But I got to be a little bit snarky with it. I think what's really funny is that I got a 1-star review on it on Amazon from some guy who said that my problem was that I wrote from the perspective of a Southerner. Well, I am a Southerner. And I wrote a pretty long foreword to the book where I talked about that. I said, I'm not Bruce Catton. I do not write from a Yankee perspective. I write from a Southern perspective. I had 24 relations in that war that I know of, several of which who died in the war. And this was childhood stories from the time I can remember. So I'm Southern to the core. The book it still sells pretty okay. It actually sells a few copies a month to this day. And I think the thing that I've been told that it's too much of is it's just too much. That I just poured too much into it. That it's a overflowing vessel of information. Well, when you get into, I have a friend of mine, lives out in Utah. I love her to death. And she talks about that when she was in school, how much she loved history. And I had said something to her about one day about how I got a real writer had turned in a paper. The thing was like 20 pages long, and it was like intricate and detailed. And you could tell this kid just loved what they were writing about. And she's, oh yeah, that was me. That was me. Oh, you ask me a question, I'll give you, a 10,000 word answer just, and keep adding on to it. Well, that's the way I am. Civil War to me is fascinating in so many aspects. And there's so much to talk about. And there's so many interesting little tidbits here and there. And I know I can't fit them all in one book. But I guess I just did. And we got into a lot of fights about that book with the publisher. They didn't want me to use the word forthwith. Well, I was a fan of Blue Bloods. And I liked that line. So I said, I want to use that line. I finally won. They let me use it. But it was that kind of stuff. And did you mean to say this? Did you mean to say that? Along about the same time, I actually got to write part of an encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of the American Civil War, which is this big, huge 5-volume thing. And they invited me to write the history of the Atlanta campaign. And I didn't copy from any of my books. I just went back and did original research. But it ends up reading almost exactly the same. And I think this is the danger. Matter of fact, I heard Ambrose one time was accused of plagiarization. And a lot of times when you write something, you're writing it, but you may have read something a long time ago, not even read it. It's in your unconscious. Or this is just the way you write things and the way you say things. So you're just being yourself. So that's what that was all about. If you pick up the encyclopedia, you find it in a library or something, it's like wildly expensive. And you read the Atlanta campaign section, you'll see, well, this reads a lot like some of your other books. Well, it's the same story. Going on, also wrote this one. It happened in Atlanta. This was another one I was pitched and asked to write. It had some pretty stiff requirements. This is it's what I call vignette history. It's little stories, fun little book to write. Boy, they were on my case like Donkey Kong. They were not going to let me be snarky. It's my least snarky book. It's the most straightforward book I've written. I had one person tell me it was their favorite book of mine. I'm not really sure what to make of that. The last published book I wrote, which was in 2012, which shows you how long ago all this was. Man, that was, 14 years ago? Was Speaking Ill of the Dead, Jerks in Georgia History. And this was another book that was pitched to me by that same publisher, and they needed a writer for Georgia. They were doing a series of these for each state. And I jumped at it. I said, this is going to be fun. And it was. I got to be really snarky, got to be really nasty. They had a rule that I had to get an exception to that said I couldn't write about anybody after 1940 because they were really afraid of lawsuits. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. Well, two things happened. Number one, this is the first book I ever got serious death threats about. I'm a history writer. Who's threatening me? And for what reason? Well, it turns out that in southern Georgia, there was a small town doctor who, long story short, was basically a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of person. And I got wind of it, and I went, wow, this is great. And, I don't really remember all the details today, but I called down there, and the first thing I usually do is call the reference librarian at whatever library is local to the area I'm writing about. And 99.5% of the time, they're wonderful to work with, happy to help you, and this was no exception. She was pretty new to the area. And so I told her what I was looking into, and she said she hadn't heard about that, but she'd look. I got a call the next day from her, panicked, saying, please don't call her back. Please drop this project. That she was told if she even uttered this guy's name again, she would be fired. And I'm like, okay. And then I got a letter, she said, this is a letter from a lawyer. And another phone call that was a lot less friendly from a fellow who, I'm not positive, but I think he was the son of the particular doctor I'm talking about. Now, bear in mind, this happened nearly 100 years ago. It was a long time before this. This is, about 80 years ago, if I remember correctly. And I'm like, what is this? Well, I found out later that the excuse given, because I talked to some other people down there, talked to my publisher, and they were like, you can go with it if you want to, but this might not be something worth pursuing. What I think happened was, the excuse was that the son of the man I was going to write about was planning on writing a book about the whole thing, and he didn't want any competition. Well, maybe. I don't know. It's been quite a few years now. I don't really remember very much about it. Needless to say, I don't think I've seen any book about this. But there was a couple others where I got nervous going in and being there. There's some. We have long memories here in the South, but the first person I talked about was John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. And I'm not going to tell you what he did, but he was a jerk when he was here. So I just thought it was amusing starting off with that. And he later made something better of himself. And then there's Blackbeard in there and a few others. But the writing of this book, why do we write books? There is the pure, I'm trying to make some money off of it, and I made a little bit, not a whole lot. I probably spent more than I made trying to do stuff. There is the factor of trying to add to the common knowledge, and historians tend to fall into that camp a lot. I think I fall into the camp where this is something I feel like doing. This is something that's kind of my calling. I want to write. I want to let this stuff out. And I don't want misperceptions to continue. It drives me nuts. This is why looking at X and Facebook today just drives me bananas. Because you get these people, as I said in an earlier podcast, I had one of my own family members call me a Nazi one day, a couple of months ago. And it's like, really? It's like, no. And this is not accurate. This is not what's going on. And you have these people who have very little idea about how the world really worked and about what's going on. And you see these constant videos on TikTok and YouTube and other places where they'll come up to a college student, hey.
How long is a quarter of an hour?
20 minutes.
You got me on that one.
Oh, I don't know.
It's a lot of math. I don't know.
I'm not good at math. I don't know that one.
15 minutes.
Well, these are drunk college students out on the beach, so, what do you expect? But I think in terms of the people I wrote about and the people that I'm most interested in, I'm most interested in just the common infantry guys, the common soldiers. That's what grabs my attention, holds my attention. I'm trying to make sure they're not forgotten and that we're still talking about that. As long as somebody remembers your name, you're not truly dead. I don't remember who said that. That's why I write, is I have to do it. And I want these people to be known. And I want what happened to be remembered. There's an intersection that I go through every once in a while. And it sits on a Civil War battlefield. I mean, dead straight on top of it. And there's some memorials around for that. And an airliner in 1977 crashed at that very spot, killed a bunch of people. Today, just fairly recently, like within the last 2 or 3 years, the group of representing the survivors of the airplane, I think 14 survived if I remember correctly, put up a monument there to that. So you've got this Civil War battle, monuments for it. You've got a graveyard there that's older than the Civil War battle. It's from some of the original inhabitants there. And then you got this airliner crash on top of it. And what are the odds of that? It's like, really? And you start thinking about that and say, does this mean anything? Well, maybe, maybe not. But this is what's fascinating about history, is all of it does have some sort of meaning on some level. None of it needs to be forgotten. All of it needs to be remembered. And you need people who are willing to write accurately, not the, well, Trump is a Nazi and I'm going to prove it. Not that kind of garbage. But the kind of stuff that's saying, well, why did Hitler act the way he did? Those are interesting books, and there's several of those out there. And who were the ones who were behind him that were far worse than him? There's also a lot of books about that. What can we learn from all of those things? What can we learn from anything? That's the whole point of this. What can you take away from these history books? Now, what you take away from my history books is that, A, I'm really snarky, and I like to make fun of things. I love puns, and I really get way down the weeds about detail. That's just the way I am. I think that's what makes it interesting. And that's my books, and that's a little bit about the writing life. My writing life as a teacher was interesting because I would also talk to my students about my books and what I was working on at the time, and it seemed to grab some of their attention, and others, were oblivious and living in their little teenage angst world. But I think that's why history teachers and professors always seem to be expected to write like this, is because it really gives a face. When you're teaching history, you're usually teaching survey courses and you're having to go very fast and you can't go into much detail. And here I can stop and say, I want to talk about how long it took a cannonball to get from Battery James to Fort Sumter that night. I think that's interesting. And if you don't, oh well. And if it takes me 3 hours to figure it out and then another, hour or so to write it up, so be it. So you can read the 7 words or 5 words, whatever it is. Next time's up, as you notice, I've been doing a few different things: ghost stories, MS stories, and history stories. I'm going to continue this. I hope you're enjoying this. If you want to hear anything, please just let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe. Help me grow this channel a little bit. I'm not really looking for it to replace my earnings because I don't have any earnings. I'm retired. But if you like it, please let me know. And I have a email address now, and it's down there in the description. And if you have any ideas, or if you violently disagree with me about something, or you got a good joke or good meme, let me know and send it to me. And until then, though, I hope I see you here the next time on the Cranky Old Historian. Y'all be careful out there.